Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the Theology of the Apostle Paul by Professor James Dunn. We're going to take a look at the additional lesson here in Christology, but now we're going to take a look at the work of Christ. We're going to take a look at the first ever doctrine of atonement, the doctrine of atonement. Let's go to block 1 and we'll get started. In Paul's early Christology, Christ becomes both mercy seat and the offering sprinkled on the mercy seat. Romans 3:25 and 26, written around AD 56, 20 years after Damascus Road. God has sent forth Christ to be a propitiation through faith in his blood to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins, through the forbearance of God, to declare his righteousness that he might justify those who believe in Jesus Christ. And the term used there is hilasterion dia pisteas. It's atonement through faith. Atonement for sins through faith. Christ is the place of atonement, and Christ is the sacrifice itself for atonement. For Paul, and we're going to get into block 2 when we look at the Old Testament reference, but Paul goes back to Leviticus and interprets his encounter with Christ through the Hebrew Day of Atonement and the writings in Leviticus. We'll get to that in block 2. Let's go on to block 1, note 2, Galatians 3:13 and 14, written in AD 52, written immediately after the Jerusalem Council. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree," so that the blessing of Abraham might come unto the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, to receive the promise of Spirit through faith. Through faith. The blessing of Abraham was always intended to include the Gentiles. Go to Colossians 2:11 through 15. In Christ you were circumcised with the spiritual circumcision of Christ. You were buried with him in baptism and raised with him through the faith of the operation of God. Note that, through God's faithfulness. Atonement comes through God's faithfulness for Paul. Because of God's faithfulness and because of the righteousness of Christ, we have atonement for sins. Everything is on the side of God. It's a powerful act of grace for Paul. Because of the faithfulness of God the Father, through the righteousness of the Son, we have atonement for sin. But we need to go to block 2 and take a look at where this all initially started, because this didn't exist. Paul is the very first systematic theologian in history. There was no such thing as Christology. Paul wrote the very first Christology ever in systematic theology. But he had to go back to his Hebrew scriptures, because that's what he had for his Bible, was the Hebrew scriptures. And in block 2 we're going to take a look at where Paul had to go to work out a new doctrine of atonement. He had to go back to the scriptures. Let's go to block 2. Paul is the first theologian to posit Christ's death as a sin offering. Paul interpreted the death of Christ on the cross as a sin offering for atonement. He had to reread Leviticus 16:11 through 15 through the lens of Christ. Make a note of that. Block 2, note 1. He had to reread Leviticus 16:11 through 15 through the lens of Christ. Aaron shall bring the sin offering and shall make an atonement for himself and his house. And he shall kill the bullock sin offering. Then take a censer of burning coals from off the altar and bring it within the veil, and put the incense upon the fire before the Lord, so that a cloud of incense covers the entire mercy seat. Then he will take the blood of the bullock and sprinkle it upon the mercy seat. How does Paul take up sacrificial imagery for his doctrine of atonement through Christ? Paul posits a redemptive suffering of the Christ. We go to Romans 3:25 and 26, and it becomes Paul's response to universal indictment, all enclosed within the category of righteousness before God. Paul is writing a theology of righteousness before God. So let's take a look at that Romans 24 through 26, written in AD 56, 20 years after Damascus Road. Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption in Jesus Christ, who God has put forth as a propitiation through faith in his blood to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins. The key concept for Paul is hilasterion, which is the reference to the mercy seat. So here's a question that I put to all of you. Is Christ the place of atonement, or is Christ the means of atonement, or is Christ both? Now, I'll give you my opinion, but we can discuss this in life group. I think that Paul interpreted Christ as both. The place of atonement is the resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. You have to gather at the foot of the cross for atonement. But his blood is the means of that atonement, so I think Paul intended for Christ to be interpreted as the hilasterion, place and means both of atonement for sin. Well, that's my opinion, but that is the way that I read Paul. That's the way that I think Paul interpreted his encounter with Christ. But I love the fact that Professor Dunn took us to where Paul had to go. I mean, this is all brand new. There was no such thing as a Christology. Paul's the first systematic theologian. He wrote the first ever Christology in human history. And Paul had to somehow make sense with an exalted, glorified Christ he encountered on Damascus Road, who was the same Christ who was nailed to a Roman cross and died as a curse. How can the Messiah become a curse? How can the exalted Jesus, the Christ, have been the same Christ who was nailed to a Roman cross as a curse? Paul had to wrestle with that, and trust me, it took some wrestling. He had to come to terms with that, and the way he came to terms with it was to reread Leviticus 16 and to be the first theologian to posit Christ's death as the sin offering. Christ's death on the cross is the universal sin offering for atonement. That is, I mean, we've had 2,000 years of additional study and learning and teaching and theology. This is first century. Paul had to wrestle through the Hebrew scriptures and try to come to terms with a Christ, and he recognized Jesus as the Christ after Damascus Road, but then he had to come to terms with that same Christ was nailed to a Roman cross as a curse. How can the Messiah be exalted as a crucified Messiah? And the way he did that was to wrestle through a rereading of Leviticus 16:11 through 15, and to posit for the very first time in human history the death of Christ as a sin offering. Let's go to block 3. Paul uses peri hamartias to translate Christ as a sin offering. Very important. Romans 8:3 and 4, written AD 56, 20 years after Damascus Road. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God, in sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but walk after the Spirit. Peri hamartias is used in the same way as the Septuagint to mean as a sin offering. This is the proper translation guided by the Septuagint. Paul interpreted Christ nailed to a Roman cross as a universal sin offering. Underline that, highlight that, circle that. Paul interpreted Christ nailed to a Roman cross as a universal sin offering. Propitiation through faith demanded that Paul reinterpret Leviticus 16 through the lens of Jesus as the Christ. Because of this, Paul concludes that Christ was sacrificed as a universal sin offering. Go also to 1 Corinthians 5:7, written AD 56. Purge out the old leaven, that you might be a new lump, unleavened. For even Christ, our paschal lamb, is sacrificed for us. And Paul writes, ta, pascha hemon, paschal lamb, or you can translate it Passover lamb. For Paul, Jesus is the Passover lamb. Paul is the Passover lamb. Paul interprets the crucifixion of Christ. He interprets the Messiah as the Passover lamb, the paschal lamb. Our paschal lamb, ta, pascha hemon, our paschal lamb. Ta, pascha hemon, our Passover lamb. Christ is the atoning Messiah by becoming universal sin offering. Christ became universal sin offering on the cross for the atonement of sin. Through his righteousness and through the faithfulness of the Father, by grace alone, through faith alone, and it's all on the side of God and Christ the Messiah. We have atonement for sin because the Father is faithful toward the covenant, the new covenant. And we have atonement for sin because Christ, his righteousness is reckoned toward us, toward all those who have faith in Christ. We are reckoned righteous through his righteousness by the faithfulness of God and the grace of God. And for Paul, the very first Christian systematic theologian in history, the first person to ever write a Christology ever, also was the very first theologian to write a doctrine of atonement, and he wrote a doctrine of atonement. And he wrote it in Romans, wrote it in 1 Corinthians, and he had to go back and reread Leviticus 16, 11 through 15. He had to reread the Leviticus law and then interpret it through the lens of experiencing Jesus as the Christ. Paul had to take his Damascus Road experience, which was an apocalypse. He had to take that apocalyptic experience and apply that apocalyptic experience to a rereading and a relearning of Leviticus 16 so that he might be the first systematic theologian to posit a doctrine of atonement that posited Jesus Christ as a sin offering. Tremendous, tremendous lesson. And I love the fact that Professor Dunn took us through the systematic theology of Romans. That's block 1. That's Paul's systematic theology is the book of Romans. That is Paul's systematic theology. So he started us in Romans 3, but then in block 2 he took us through the Hebrew Scriptures. Paul had to go back to Leviticus. He had to go back to Leviticus 16. So he's writing Romans 3, but he had to go back to Leviticus 16 in order to do that. So I love the fact that Professor Dunn took us there. So we look at the starting point for a systematic theology of atonement in block 1, and then we look at the moment of relearning and being re-educated in block 2 as Paul went back to Leviticus 16, and then we get the final mature theology of a doctrine of atonement in block 3, where Christ uses perihamartias to translate Christ as a sin offering, which is tremendously powerful. That's going to wrap up 208 to 218 on the very first doctrine of atonement ever written in human history, written by the Apostle Paul.